All right, we are so excited today to partner with Wingate University to talk about how to transform your clearance process with the power of Salesforce. Today, we will just do a brief overview of who we are at Elevation Solutions. Then we're going to dive into clearance and talk a little bit about what it is and what are the challenges and opportunities behind a really solid clearance process. Wingate University is going to share their story, and then we'll show a demo of the front end and back end of the clearance process. Feel free to ask any questions using the Q&A feature during this webinar, and we will get to them at the end. All right, so just to introduce ourselves, my name is Lise Hastings. I am the account director at Elevation Solutions, and I'll kick it over to Sarah to introduce herself.
Thanks, Elise. My name is Sarah Ross, and I'm the CEO of Elevation Solutions.
And then Steve and Alex, could you guys introduce yourself, share a little bit about your background?
Yep, absolutely. Steve Shank, I'm the VP for Information Technology and the CIO here at Wingate University.
I'm Alex Flynn. I'm the Salesforce Administrator for our Service Cloud org at Wingate University.
Okay, great. All right, just to speak a little bit more about who we are at Elevation Solutions, we are a technology consulting firm, and we focus on really using the power of Salesforce to configure it for your unique people, processes, and goals. We focus on human services organizations, so education, nonprofit, and healthcare. We are a premium Salesforce partner with a team averaging 9 years in experience in Salesforce consulting, and we were Education Partner of the Year in 2021. We are very excited to focus on all different types of projects with colleges and universities, anything from getting you started with admissions to a full kind of connected campus experience. All right, to dive into clearance. So what is clearance? What are we talking about when we are talking about the clearance process? We're really discussing that melt rate. So anything from when your student puts in that first deposit, says that they're going to be attending your college or university, to actually when they get into that first day of class, right? So usually this is a process that's over the summer. And nationally, this can be a big issue in terms of melt. So 10 to 20% of new students melt before their first day of class. This can be very high in community colleges, and first generation and low income students are particularly impacted. And when we talk about melt, it really is influenced by human factors. So if you can kind of take yourself back to your high school days, as you're bombarded during finals, you have prom, you have kind of your last summer with your friends, there's a lot going on. And this means that there can be disorganized communications. There's a lot of required activities. And then when we're talking about the college and university experience, there can be confusing processes there. There's health immunization records that you need to submit. There's housing, and there can be some lack of support from institutions to how to navigate that process. This can be very overwhelming, and email and phone calls are still widely used across institutions, and these really do have low response rates when you're looking at the student population and kind of our current climate. There is no single solution that really exists to help institutions manage this critical period. Processes can be really spread across departments, and they can be very siloed. Wingate can speak to this when they talk about their experience with clearance. The requirement statuses really change daily, so something that you thought was completed yesterday actually hasn't been logged yet, so the departments really can't keep track of what's going on. And then there's just emails and calls going out to students from each department, which can create a confusing process. When we talk about the opportunity with clearance, there are few ways to grow total enrollment at your institution. There's increased new enrollments, right? There is increased retention, and then there's reduced melt. And what we found is institutions somewhat ignore that last bullet of reducing melt. They can accept their melt rate and chalk it up to a declining enrollment to admissions, the market, the education landscape. But Elevation Solutions has been probing here, and we have been uncovering a different story. So clearance processes can be really manual, and institutions stop that kind of selling to students after the deposit. And that what happens is students aren't paying their bills on time, and they might not even show up at all. So we really decided to create a solution to address clearance. Although, the requirements have to be well defined, and it's less effort and cost to keep a student who has said yes than to go out and get a new one. So the ROI here, the impact is a no-brainer. We have some sample data here to just kind of exemplify what this can look like, right? So let's just say that you have 5,000 students that deposited and you have a current melt rate of 25%. If we look at that melt rate and we say, let's just take it down by 2%, let's address this clearance process, let's kind of put our full energy to supporting students over that summer to lower that melt rate, we can be really looking at a net new students of attending of 100, if we're, again, just talking about a 5K student population. And that can be a total increase in annual net tuition revenue of 1.2 million. So again, this is just sample data, but this can be a huge impact to your institution. All right, so I'm going to kick it over to Steve, who's going to share a little bit about the Wingate University story.
Thanks, Elise. I would say, for me, I've been at Wingate since 2017. And so my first experience with the clearance process was the incoming class during the summer of 18. And so I see what it looks like, right? The physical experience for the student, for the families. It was hot. August, North Carolina is it can be challenging by itself. But a lot of lines, a lot of people, just frustration, right? But as you can see just in the numbers here, I mean, it takes a village just to execute this process. So you can see when you look at a number of different departments that have got to collect information from students from the point of deposit to the point of arrival, a number of people. So the resources, it's a resource intensive process. But then when you look at the volumes of tasks and the volumes of things to track as well are pretty high. When you look at 27,000 combined things for at the beginning of each year. So you've got silos, so you've got all these different competing forces that are impacting the student's experience in this process. So then as we fast forward from 18 to 19, we then said, all right, well, what did this process look like? What did it yield going into 2019? And that summer process, I would say roughly 50% of the things that were required to be completed got completed, maybe a little bit higher than that. But I don't have an exact number because everything was done by silos. There were different perspective of what clear was. And we needed to get some consistency and determine what, how to tackle this problem, right? So all these things that Elise pointed out about improving that experience from the point of deposit to the point of arrival, a lot of it plays into this administrative component that we call clearance. So going into 2019, fall 2019, we knew where we stood. We then started this process of building our clearance solution on Salesforce. Then roughly March 2019, we all know what happened, right? COVID hit. And as we were working our way through that process and into the summer, we kind of got a little bit lucky that we had started this in advance of COVID and the pandemic. And when we looked at the class of 20, not the class of, but the incoming fall 20 class, we then had some real data, real metrics, and real improvement. So if you go to the next slide, Elise, I mentioned that we were roughly sitting somewhere in the 50%, just over that, prior to the incoming class in 20. So the class of 20, as we went through that entire class, that incoming group of students, both new and returning students, completed 81% of their student clearance requirements prior to the first day of class. And it's not really it's not a question number. We knew which items got done, which items didn't. And the fact that we had a community for the families and their students to access, to be able to view the requirements, knew where they stood, make it easy to submit them, improving how we communicate with students, letting them know when things were due, when they were complete, yielded a pretty significant result, I think, in our clearance requirements. One example was, once we started doing the nudges, which we finally got implemented after the process had already started, we saw a one-day uptick of over 2,000 requirements completed. That was just a reminder that was sent to say, hey, these things are past due. So what's also nice about this is that allowed us to then start to change, right? Now we had hard data. We knew what was working. We knew what wasn't working. And when you look now at fall 21, we made the incremental changes and we actually are sitting at 91% complete prior to the first day of class. So that's where you want to be. That's where you want to see improve as you start to have somewhere to start to measure, know what's working, what's not, and continue to make that experience better for the students and for, frankly, the faculty and staff as well that are part of the process.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve.
Absolutely.
That was a great explanation of just where you came from and where you're at now. So I think we're ready to, let's dive into your system. Let's talk about what you guys have built here. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and Alex is going to give us a quick demo.
Thanks, Elise. All right, so we're going to go ahead and just start looking at what a student is looking at. So we're looking at the clearance checklist of our test student and test. So that's why, don't worry, she doesn't have a lot complete, but she is a test student. But you can see this is a really easy visual for students to log into one place and see exactly what they need to complete before they step foot on campus. I think one of the powerful things about even just the login process, and it sounds small, but I think it makes a big difference, is that students log in with their Wingate single sign-on. So they don't have to have a separate Salesforce username and password. It's easy for students to be sent a Marketing Cloud email with a link that they can click directly to take them to their checklist from their Wingate email. And so again, just something small that I think has a big impact and gets students used to using their Wingate single sign-on information as well. As we scroll through, you can see that there's some kind of description about the checklist itself and the purpose. And there's also a link so that they can go to our orientation website if they have any questions at all. But as we're moving through, you can see that there are clearance requirements. And for our incoming students, we have 16 in total. You can see that there's the status for each clearance requirement that changes, and the student is able to see the last updated date for that status as well. A student is able to see a little bit more information. Most of our clearance requirements are required. We try to only put those that are on the checklist. And then a description about the particular clearance requirement and a button to click in order to complete the actual clearance requirement. I will note some things that we have found that have been particularly helpful. We have some clearance requirements that need to be linked out to a separate website, whether that's a health portal in Medicat or Blue Cross Blue Shield for student health insurance. But 7 out of our 16 clearance requirements are directed to the students, to a form that the student can complete. For example, the math placement exam is a form assembly form. And so 7 of those clearance requirements are created through form assembly. And I think that that just helps with kind of uniformity, but also the ability for that status to change instantaneously, which we know students, this day and age, students, but also we like to see that instantaneous update. So they're able to see that really easily here. We can see also from the internal side of Bulldog Central, everything operates kind of off the data model of terms, contacts, and clearance requirements. And so we'll walk through a little bit of each of those and how they all fit together to kind of create this student clearance process that Elevation helped us to build. So to start with, the term object is where you're able to actually set what term should be used for the clearance app. And what that basically means is that when a student is enrolled for that term, they have clearance requirements that are created specifically for that term. So that means that only students that are enrolled for that specific term are going to have those on their checklist, and that specific term is what's going to be live when a student logs into their checklist at that time. And you can see very easily, it's just in the terms object, and it's by term name, and it's just a simple checkbox of use for clearance app. So really, really simple. As we're looking through this, our list of clearance requirements are set up on the clearance requirements custom object. And this is where each clearance requirement is housed, and it's going to show, I'm going to click on an example of our math placement exam. But it's really easily going to show everything for that specific clearance requirement. So for example, we can see that this is named math placement exam. We're able to see the URL that students are directed to within that button link. We're able to change the button text at any point in time if we want to here, as well as the description. So this has been something that the fact that this is really easy, click that code allows us to make those instantaneous changes that our internal users request as things change. Steve alluded to kind of, we implemented this right before COVID. And so a lot of things may have changed during that time. So that allowed us to make those changes right away for our internal users and our stakeholders. We can also see that we can activate a clearance requirement here or deactivate it. One example of this was really helpful to just have as a checkbox was, as we were kind of going through that summer of after COVID first started in March, we weren't going to have an in-person orientation anymore. So having orientation registration on our checklist didn't really make sense given that. So we were able to really quickly deactivate this checklist requirement and then delete it from the checklist for those students, which made that process really simple. We're also able to see a description of these checklist items. So we've determined that there are kind of two different student types that are seeing this checklist. One is our incoming students, so our population of first-time freshmen, transfer, and readmit students, and then continuing students. And of course, our incoming students do have a few more checklist items that they need to take care of just because it's their first semester. And so we're able to see really quickly what specific student population this clearance requirement refers to, and we can see based on this that it's our incoming students. And then that is set via an Apex class that can easily be changed kind of in the background for any additional clearance requirements that are created as well. As we're looking here, if we want to go to a specific student's clearance requirements, and I'm just going to show you based on a student's contact record. And again, we're going to go to our test student. If any of our internal users from any department across campus wants to see where a student is at with their completion of their clearance requirements, it's really simple for them to search for the student and pull up their contact record. And within the related list quick links, they can easily click on student clearance requirements. And they can view an entire list of not only just the fall semester, and I've filtered to fall 2021 here to make it easier to view, but you can also view all previous semesters as well. So if you're wondering if a student completed their health forms during their freshman year, you can easily pull that up. If you're wondering if they have a pattern of not completing their assumption of risk, again, that's a really easy place to pull that up for them. But you're able to quickly see here what the status is of those clearance requirements. And then you're also able to dig a little bit deeper into the individual student's clearance requirement by clicking on that specific record, which takes you to the student clearance requirement custom object. So this is where you're able to see specific details about this student's student clearance requirement, that is health forms and immunization records. A few things that have been particularly helpful for our internal users and campus-wide offices is that you can easily see the date that this was last modified by our internal operations for updating this. So whether that was a process of an office needing to update that the status is complete, or that a form has modified and that this clearance requirement is completed, that's really easy for them to see right here. You can obviously also see the status of this particular clearance requirement, the term that it belongs to. But I think one of the most powerful things and one of the reasons that I wanted to bring up this health forms student clearance requirement is that we can also include notes from Wingate. And I'm not sure if you saw that on the checklist itself, but that actually shows down here to the student as well. And so, this isn't for every student clearance requirement, but for something that's a little bit more complicated, like health forms and immunization records, this is really helpful for a student to know, okay, I didn't complete this clearance requirement, but what am I still missing? That was a question that students got and that our health center was inundated with phone calls about. And this makes it really easy for an integration to update these notes from Wingate with exactly what the student is missing at that given point in time. So again, it just allows the student to have that much more information without having to reach out to another office. And then they can go and complete those requirements via their checklist. Another really helpful piece that our users like to use is, again, just standard Salesforce functionality, but just having some history tracking on the fields that are particularly useful. I think one of these is status. And so our users are able to then see, okay, on this date at this time was when a status was changed for this particular clearance requirement. And again, that just helps to kind of, when there are some questions that come in that aren't as detailed as maybe they could be, it helps for our users to be able to go in and really use the internal system to help with answering some of those questions. We can see that this is also tied to a term enrollment record. And so we talked a little bit about how this is all based on the data model of terms and term enrollments. But if we click on this term enrollment record, I'm just going to show a little bit more information about kind of how we were able to leverage what Elevation Solutions built for us and use that for communication within the system. So we have a field called not complete student clearance requirements and then complete student clearance requirements. But this allows us to populate a roll-up field on the term enrollment record where we are able to populate this with all not submitted student clearance requirement items. And as Steve mentioned, this is something that we started to utilize with our nudge emails. And we saw an uptake of about 2,000 student clearance requirements completed within a day of those nudge emails going out. But this allows us to populate those nudge emails with the specifics of what that student hasn't completed at that given point in time. So again, just kind of directing them to the checklist, but also giving them some really easy ways to see, okay, these are the things that you haven't completed yet. In addition, we have something called our all clear integer, and we'll touch base on a little bit about this as we look at some of our reports and dashboards in relation to clearance. But we found, especially, given COVID and kind of the time that we released this, that there were some clearance requirements that were maybe a little more important than others to complete before a student stepped foot on campus. And so we narrowed those down to there were a top 5, some of those being student account balance, health forms and immunization records, the student financial responsibility agreement. And so those top 5 are what we are populating this formula field with. And so if a student has completed all of those top 5 clearance requirements, they'll have a 1 in this field. If they have completed, 4 out of 5 or less, they'll have a 0. And so they're we're able to see, okay, how many students are technically all clear by our standards or are all clear on those really important clearance requirements that we want to make sure they at least have done before they step foot on campus. Kind of the last piece that we have found really helpful, especially when we're looking at data year over year in terms of how we ended with clearance. And Steve touched on this a little bit in some of his data points, but we were able to develop a dashboard, and Elevation developed this for us as well. But we were able to show the number of complete and not submitted student clearance requirements. And you can see that this is for fall 2021. But here's where that kind of top 5 or all clear integer comes into play. And we can see that we have about 80% of our students are all clear. But if we scroll down a little bit more, we're able to see that actually this fall, 91% of the clearance requirements have been completed. And so again, this just allows for a really quick snapshot of being able to view, okay, how many clearance requirements have been completed? Which are those? What's the percentage that they have been completed by at any given point in time? And not only are we able to look at them by the status of the clearance requirement, but we're also able to then look at those by the incoming student population, as well as our continuing students. So again, just really simple wins for being able to have that snapshot of where our data is at any given point in time. And then, obviously being able to look at that year over year, and as opposed to, our 2020 fall, where our percentage of total student clearance requirements was completed at 81%, and now we're at 91% this fall. So really simple way to view all of that. I'll hand it back over to Elise.
Okay, great. That was such a wonderful overview of your clearance project, and thank you so much for demoing it. We think we need you to demo everything from now on. You did such a wonderful job there. So, now just if we had any questions that we wanted to address, this is the time for it. I'm going to ask Amanda, is there anything that was submitted that we want to answer right now before we call it a day?
Sure, I'll go ahead. We have a few questions to cover, and we'll throw those over for Steve and Alexandra. The first I have is, how did you navigate getting buy-in from all teams impacted by this project? It expands across many different departments across the university, and we all know everyone has their own way of doing things. So how did you manage that as you started to kind of talk about this project with everyone?
Alex is probably going to wait for me to answer this one, but I would say it's sort of it's a bit of work in progress. Honestly, it's you start off with the area that that was really kind of craving help, right? I mean, it was evident. It was easy to get people together at the table to want to do something different, and so we kind of listened to what the requirements were, worked with everybody to start to understand, what's the as-is process? What's the desired to-be process? And start to try to map that out. I think when I say getting buy-ins a work in progress, I mean, it's, is it perfect? It's not, right? I mean, there's still things that we can get better at. I mean, even as evident by the numbers that we're seeing year to year. Part of what I think the improvements that we're making are on our own internal processes, right? It's something else that maybe wasn't bought in. It's now seeing, wait a minute, if you went from this percentage to this, and now from 81 to 91, what else can I do to start to help that? And so some of it happens organically, but I would say with regards to clearance, that's how we started. I mean, we sort of parachuted in, honestly, and saw this as a problem. We saw the amount of work it required to just simply execute this. And it just wasn't sustainable. I mean, we, and like every other institution, wants to continue to grow, and, throwing more people onto it is not the answer. And so, we were, I would say, past the point of trying to make a process better, automate as much as we could. I think once people started seeing that and understanding the concept better, it really started to pick up some steam.
Yeah. And I think a lot of stuff with Salesforce is always kind of in progress because it's so flexible and you can continue to change. And like you guys were talking about, you found things to improve from year 1 to year 2 to make things better. So to sort of piggyback on top of that question, you kind of talked a lot about the students and kind of how they've adopted the system. What did you guys do to encourage adoption within your own team members to keep them excited throughout the project and then really support them as they started using the system?
Alex, you want to take that one and talk a little bit about some of the folks we're working with?
Yeah, I think one of the major things is training and just, touch points throughout each point of the year. I think it's really easy when, everyone's in different areas of campus. And of course, clearance isn't at the top of their mind throughout the entire year. And it's really easy if you maybe haven't been in that part of the system to forget kind of where to go for certain things. And so we try to, at least touch base with our stakeholders at the beginning of kind of each clearance cycle before that point to just make sure that there aren't any changes that they need made. But also to ask about any pain points that they maybe had from the previous semester. We obviously did this a lot after our first round of clearance and have kind of, tapered off and are now doing those check-ins about once per semester. But I think that was really key, is just having that, but then also having kind of a few go-to people that they know they can ask questions for and provide some training if they need to, especially as, new people enter the office and are using the system as well.
Yeah. Training is so key. And then that continued cycle of feedback, to continue to improve and make things better for the users, because there's always things you discover once the users are in the system on ways you can make it better for them and the user interface and how they interact with the system. Thank you. Awesome. So another question we have is kind of regarding the information within the system. A lot of the information is traditionally held within a student information system. So does your clearance solution talk to your student information system to kind of let that know that students have been cleared, and kind of how do you handle that transfer of data and ensuring everything's up to date within Salesforce and also with your student information system?
Sure. With our particular model, our student information system, the data flows over into Service Cloud. And so it doesn't flow back to our student information system yet. I think that's something that we have the ability to cross into that if it's needed. And I think that's one of the really powerful things, is that we can continue to develop this based on what our needs are from our users. But right now that data flow is coming right over from our student information system into Service Cloud, or our clearance site. I think one of the powerful things about that, though, is that we're also then able to pull in reports and see not only, okay, which students didn't complete their clearance requirements, but if we want to pull in information about you know, what was their high school GPA or their standardized test scores, or, you know, look at any of that sort of data for any sort of predictive analytics. Again, it just gives us that ability to do that if that's something we choose to.
Yeah, great. Awesome. All right, so in terms of post-implementation, you guys have taken that and made a lot of changes and improved. So what would you recommend to a team that's kind of embarking on their Salesforce journey, how they build up their internal skills and kind of what they should account for and budget for internally to then continue on and support something long-term?
The budget question is always tricky, right? It's one of these, we can make a kind of the offhanded comment that, you know, add X% to what you budget, but no, that's not really the case. I mean, I think that I would say even with our, you know, with our experience, even with Elevation, I mean, it was on budget, right? And you know, it was on time for what we were working toward. And so I think the fact that the planning of that was really good. I think that, you know, how do you manage, you know, that change? You've got to essentially, you've got to develop an internal project management process. You've got to have some way of managing the intake of new requirements. I think that's one thing that we saw early on was, you know, this buy-in thing. First was us convincing folks that this is a good thing. And now it's, you know, the platform is so flexible that there really isn't too many no answers. It's just, you know, we get it a lot. Can it do this? Can it do that? Yes, but the but is our time and our capacity. And so I would say that one thing that anybody can do for themselves is to work with your partner, learn, understand, you know, how to manage, you know, the environment, but then also take that opportunity to kind of identify folks internally that have the aptitude and the willingness to kind of learn. That's, you know, you hear it and you can't say it enough, but, you know, Trailhead and the fact that that learning is just free and available is, it's an understatement. It really is. I mean, it's, it just sounds easy enough that it's there, but if you have people that are willing and able to just spend some time and go to learn it, this stuff is quickly adaptable. It's not, you know, learning just because I'm working with, you know, a partner or another institution or another department. The language is still the same. And, you know, it's, it truly is kind of like this international language where, you know, it is what it is. And you can talk to anybody. You can talk to a new developer. You can talk to a new, you know, a new stakeholder, and the terms are the terms. And so if the team can understand that, it gets really exponentially easier to start to help yourself grow. Mm-hmm. And that's important too, is that you you invest in folks that want to show and want to learn. Mm-hmm. Because that's what we did, and it's enabling our success here at Wingate. Again, we don't have a big team, but we've got big skills.
Yeah, that's the beauty of Salesforce, is the accessibility and the ability to learn. And you hear so many stories of the accidental admin, someone who took an interest in Salesforce and then took the time to build up their skills using Trailhead. So that's one fantastic thing about Salesforce, is that it is, you know, accessible, and I wouldn't necessarily say easy, but, you know, you can develop those skills over time throughout the course of your project and end with someone who really understands and can continue on to support that.
Let me just, if I could, give Alex 2 seconds to chime in, because she was one of those people. Sure. Alex is an accidental admin, and you know, she you know, maybe a little bit more purposeful, but you know, it's kind of one of those living examples, just as you've heard her explain, you know, from someone that came with no Salesforce experience that fits right in, and you'd never know if it was, you know, 10 years of experience or not that you know, she has. I don't know if she'd add anything else to that.
No, I was just going to say that you know, my previous hat was I was the director of advising at Wingate. And so I had a lot of experience with kind of the disjointed clearance process that we previously had, and where we were trying to get that to all work together. So just seeing this all come to fruition, and also having the elevation team to really help us with that was a huge help for someone who was just learning becoming an admin.
Yeah.
So really appreciative of that.
Yeah, great. Awesome. So we'll wrap up with one last question. And you guys have kind of touched on this a little bit, but when someone is looking to start a project like this, what would be kind of your biggest piece of advice to them before they embark on the journey?
I'm going to give an answer, and Alex may have an answer as well, but I would say start small, right? This is an environment that is very easy to overcook, right? And overbake. I think if you can find one meaningful thing to make a difference on, the rest will come. I say that, and you know, I gotta believe, right? Alex is probably thinking, yeah, that's always our intent. It never fails. More creeps in, but it's almost so hard not to, because you've got the environment open and say, oh well, if we just spend a little bit more time here, we could do this too. Yeah, but let's just do this. Let's just get this done. You know, meeting those commitments early on, demonstrating that it's you know, that not only it, but we are a reliable team to be able to deliver these things, you know, to the university, I think is important. Sort of sets the baseline, and you know, from there on out, you know, it's been you know, it's been positive, right? These changes are good to see, but yeah, again, incremental. Walk, right, not run, because remember, you're learning at the same time, and so it's important not to bite off too much, because it's super easy to do that.
Yeah, it is. And we call that the crawl, walk, run, right? You got to learn how to crawl before you can run, and really starting small and biting off what you can chew is so important. Alexandra, any input on that?
I think to go along with kind of what Steve said, the system, I think as you're having these conversations, think about things that can actually be marked as complete, and what determines that complete status. I think a lot of times it's easy to, you know, and this happened with our previous kind of clearance attempts, that it's easy to say, well, we want these, you know, 20 or 25 items on a checklist, but not all of them can be, how are we going to mark them as complete and actually change that status, or what indicates that that is going to be a completed requirement. So I think that that's just a key piece of starting small, and a really easy question to ask is, how does that status get changed? And if it can't be, then maybe it belongs somewhere else. So I think that's a big piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Planning well and ensuring that you can define exactly what means success is so important. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Steve and Alexandra, for kind of walking us through how Wingate has been successful with clearance. We really appreciate that. And again, if there are any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we can follow up with those. But thanks for joining, and I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of their day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.